and it's a look at psychological safety and identifying the hazards that create a physiologically unsafe environment. And that is brought to us by today's speaker. We have Mr. Daniels joining us, who is the president and CEO of I2T Solutions LLC. And I also have David's information here. If anybody would like to reach out to David, here is his contact information, so you can screenshot that or jot that down. But we'd love to hear a more formal introduction from you, sir. We appreciate you joining us today, and go ahead and give you control. So there you go.
Why, thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I think it looks like Brian's going to have to drive the presentation this morning. There we go. There we go. And so, Brian, what I'll try to, once you get into the slide deck, I'll just give you the next, and you can pop into the next slide.
Okay.
A couple of introductory comments. First of all, it is a pleasure to be able to share this information with a hometown crowd. And when I say hometown, I mean that. I currently live in South Fulton, Georgia, which is a suburb of the city of Atlanta. As a matter of fact, the city that I live in will be 5 years old next month. So the city was formed from scratch about 5 years ago. And I've lived in the community for a number of years, but I was born and raised in Seattle. I'm a graduate of Garfield High School. As a matter of fact, the last time they won a league championship, I was playing. That's how long ago I went there. And I went into the Seattle Fire Department a few years out of high school, and left there as an assistant fire chief 21 years ago. And when I left, I was the assistant chief of safety and employee services. And that role had me responsible for safety, human resources, training, and our EEO function. I also want to share that the first certification in safety that I ever received, I received from the Evergreen Safety Council. And I'm still certified as a safety and health specialist through Evergreen. And we were talking about CEUs. I think I'd come up in another year or two to turn in my CEUs to maintain that, because I've just kept it over the years because it's very special to me. So that's a little bit about me. I'll share a few other applicable notes as we get into the presentation. But so next slide. My question for you today is it relates to our workplaces and how safe they actually are. So
Brian, hold on. I'm trying.
Okay.
I'm trying here. Okay, there we go.
Okay, there we go. There we go. My question to the safety professionals that are assembled here today is, are our workplaces safe? And I think if we were to ask that question in general, the answer would be, well, it kind of depends. It really depends on which conversation we're having. And so in the next slide, I want to suggest that yes, since the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act and since the creation of OSHA, between 1972 and 2018, our workplaces are substantially safer than they used to be. They're much safer than they used to be. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing. Non-fatal injuries and illnesses in the workplace have decreased significantly. The challenge is that we've only been tracking a certain kind of injury. Okay. Next. So we've, again, a 73.4% decrease in non-fatal injuries and illnesses. But in the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what it is we are actually tracking. So private industry employers will tell you that in 2018, we had 2.8 million non-fatal injuries and illnesses, and that was really unchanged from 2018. In 2020, we had 2.1 million, so that number decreased. But the challenge is what we've been tracking in this system. So next, if you hit next, we have actually been tracking mostly physical injuries and illnesses. So that's what's gotten better. That's a good thing. It's wonderful that workers can now go to work, and most workers can be assured that they're in a safe workplace. Not all, but a lot It is a lot safer than it used to be back in the early 1900s when high-rise buildings were built and they actually predicted that you'd have so many deaths for every floor of construction of the building. It was not uncommon for people to get killed at work virtually every day, and folks really didn't think it was that big of a deal. It was just part of the price of doing business. And thankfully, things have gotten better. Next slide, please. They've gotten better again, principally because a lot of workplaces are safer because they have to be. Not necessarily because folks are necessarily focused on the health and safety of the human beings who work there, but they kind of have to. And we found this out again, a little bit of the fire service experience. I was in Seattle in 1995 when we lost the last 4 firefighters, and thankfully that trend has stopped. Between 1993 and 1995, 9 of the people that I worked with in Seattle either got killed at work or died from something that's directly connected to their work. And that is one of the motivators for me in being a safety professional now, is trying to help people avoid those kinds of circumstances. As a matter of fact, over the course of my 32 years in and around fire services, I've seen 19 people either get killed at work or die from something that's directly connected to their work. I just want that to settle for you, because those are real people whose families no longer have them. They had to go through. I've been to a lot of the funerals and that type of thing, and it leaves an impression on you. And so I take safety very seriously, and that's part of the reason that I do. But what I've observed is that what the OSH Act did is helped us reduce physical injuries, but in the 19,674 words in the Act, it only mentions psychological twice. The OSH Act was never intended to address what we talk about in the next slide. So in the United States, 21% of adults, or about almost 53 million people, have experienced some form of mental illness, and 14 million of them have experienced serious mental illness. So just look back at the numbers. Only 2.1 million injuries related to the physical environment, but 53 million emotional ones. And again, I want to be clear that mental illness and exposure to a psychosocial hazard they're different things, but they're certainly related. And I'll talk about that more here in just a second. So I can argue that we may not be tracking everything that we need to track. So next slide, please.
Hey, Brian and Dr. David, hold on one second. Hey, folks, I'm not sure, somebody might have their microphone on. Can you please double check to make sure you all have your microphones on mute? That way we don't get any of your background noise of your computers and side conversations. I know sometimes that button gets pushed. So please mute, and that way we can have undivided attention. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So just recently, Gallup produced the State of the Global Workplace report. As a matter of fact, you can go out and find it. And I'll just cut to the chase. They say there are 3 reasons why people do safety in the workplace. 3 reasons. One reason is they really believe that it's important to take care of the human beings in the workplace. They're just those kind. They really care about other people. The other reason that people do it is, honestly, it can save you money. It really can. A safer workplace is a more efficient workplace. You get more done, and your costs are actually lower. And the last reason is one I mentioned already, is because you have to. Certainly in private sector employment, you have to. Having been in public sector employment most of my career, and I've been in states, again, outside of Washington that don't have a state plan. Government workers don't necessarily get those protections in only 27 states and territories actually have state plans that cover public workers. So there's a lot of states out there, and I happen to live in one of them now, that it's not as safe for public sector workers as it is for private sector. But the bottom line here is that the lack of engagement on the emotional side costs the global economy $8.1 trillion. So if you're concerned about money, you might want to take a little time to be concerned about how people feel at work. Stress, worry, sadness, anger. These are topics that safety professionals don't sometimes talk about, but these emotions eventually are contributory to some of the physical types of injuries and exposures that people have on the job. The reason that so one contributing factor to the reason that the person turned the forklift over is that they were stressed out. One of the reasons that the person brought the gun to work and started, they were angry about. So these are conversations that we have to make sure that we don't end up with the physical kinds of manifestations down the road. Next slide, please. And if you're concerned, I heard the discussion earlier about those that are both looking for work and have work available. We all, hopefully you're aware that we are in this great resignation. I'll share with you, my graduate degree is in human resources. And I did that because I figured out that there are two things that can get the boss fired quickly in the public sector. Number one is messing up the money, but number two is mistreating people. And I found that it's easier to mistreat people than it is to mishandle the money. We have lots of rules around how to handle the money. And you'll get, there are audits and all these kinds of things, but there are lots of almost accidental ways to mistreat people and to injure people in ways that sometimes you don't even realize. And there's a discussion often about, well, we can keep people, we can get good people and keep them as long as we raise our pay. I heard once that if you get into the salary arms race, you'll probably never win. The people that you draw by high salaries will leave for a higher salary someplace else. But what research has discovered is one of the major contributing factors to people leaving is the toxic culture of the organization that they're in. As a matter of fact, it is 10.4 times more important to people how they experience the culture than it is what you pay them. Okay, so that leads to our conversation in the next slide about psychological safety and psychosocial hazard mitigation. And I want to talk a little bit about both of those topics because both are important. I'm not suggesting that one is better than the other because they're not, but they are related concepts, but slightly different. So next slide, Dr. Amy Edmondson. Some of you may have heard of her. She's a Harvard professor that has, over the last number of years, been the mother of this topic, if you will. She's credited with having a discussion about the importance of psychological safety. And psychological safety is, in short, it's an environment where you can bring your whole self to work and you can be yourself, express yourself without worry of retribution, negative consequence of sharing your ideas. And again, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I have to be honest and share with you that particularly when I went into the fire service, I was extremely young and I had a lot of ideas. I still have lots of ideas. But when you're the quote unquote new guy, and again, I know this doesn't happen where you work, but the new guy, we would bring people into the fire department, put a number on their helmet and tell them basically to sit in the corner for the next year and a half until you get an opinion. And I found that aggravating because I had things to say on day one, but I wasn't able to say them. I wasn't able to contribute. And then sometimes when I would bring up an idea, and again, I'm just expressing my experience, the old guard or the people who disagree with me, well, that's not going to work. And this is not, well, you don't know. We haven't even tried it yet. And what I found is that my experience is not unique. There are organizations who are often so set in the way that they do things today that they bring in good new people, but don't want to hear from these good new people until they've paid their dues or been around. I have 10 grandchildren. My youngest is 4. And one of the challenges her mom and my my granddaughter and grandson have with her is that she'll grab their phone, and if they don't pay attention, she will have something posted to Instagram in seconds. So she is a lot smarter than me. She is like many of our grandchildren now who are digital natives, who are a lot better at this technology stuff than we are. They are smarter than us. And if we don't create an environment where they can use those talents and use those gifts, they will simply create their own environment to use it. So I think it's really important that people feel safe bringing their full self. Next, please. So I did my research last year. Matter of fact, just graduation's actually coming up on psychosocial hazard exposure. Instead of looking at psychological safety as this kind of leadership and management concept, which it is, and again, it's an important one, I looked at this from a safety professional's perspective. And I found that there is, again, in my research, there is a lack of appropriate attention to psychosocial hazards. And sometimes they get misinterpreted. We assume that mental illness and mental health is the same as a psychosocial hazard, and it's not. And I also found out that psychosocial resilience is really the key. It's helping people. We cannot eliminate psychosocial hazards. It's not possible to eliminate them. And I'll tell you about that here in just a second. So we have to help folks find out how to be resilient and be able to make it through them, because we can't eliminate them all. So next slide, please. So let's talk a little about the meaning of the term psychosocial. So particularly when I have this conversation with lots of folks, I come across as a bit nerdy when I say it, but again, I'll admit I'm a bit of a nerd. As a matter of fact, I haven't watched Moon Knight yet, but I'll be watching it when this presentation is over because I'm a Marvel fan. But anyway, the term psychosocial has existed in the English language since 1890. And it's the term has to do with both psychological and social. It's the relationship between human beings and the environment that a human being lives and functions in. Because it's difficult to separate the two. How we think and the environment that we're in are certainly connected, and they drive one another. Next, please. A psychosocial factor is a concept that was conceived by the Joint International Labor Organization. That's an offshoot of the United Nations, and the World Health Organization. They had a big conference back in 1984, and they came up with this list of psychosocial factors at work. And the next slide shows what these psychosocial factors look like. It's on the left, as you're looking at the screen: work environment, job content, and organizational conditions. So these have to do with the environment itself, the workplace itself, what's going on in the environment. Every work environment is different. It's experienced different. The content of the work is different. The organizational conditions are different. Because, and again, there is this attempt on the part of humans to help us understand. We try to homogenize things and make it look similar, but it's just very different. And that's why it's hard to have, standardized ways of approaching these activities in this work, because people just experience this different. And on the right-hand side, we have the worker's capacity, needs, and expectations, the customs and culture that the person brings to the job, and then the job itself, and then what's going on in the rest of their life. Let's be honest. People don't leave home at home. They don't leave their relationships at home. They don't leave their person. They just don't. They can't. We can't separate who I am and the fact that my grandma is getting sick. My roof is leaking. My car, I need a new tire. My kid, got in trouble at school last week. The dog has to, had to go to the vet. These things continue to go on in and outside of the work environment. And these factors, these psychosocial factors at work, they affect work performance, they affect job satisfaction, and they also affect a worker's health. They actually affect health. So next slide, just a reminder, and again, you've all seen this before. You're all experienced safety professionals, and you've seen these first 5 hazards. The first 5, these are the ones that the OSH Act was intended to address: biological, chemical, ergonomic, safety, physical. But we've left psychosocial hazards blank. At least in the United States, it's as if the hazard doesn't exist. But because we've not paid appropriate attention to it, we end up having more of the other. So my argument is that if we would focus on psychosocial hazards, we'd have fewer of the other 5. It is important. People can't be safe unless they feel safe. So let's talk a little bit more in the next slide about psychosocial hazard. So a psychosocial hazard is one of those psychosocial factors we talked about before that's perceived or experienced as unfavorable. And let's pause right there for a second. Perception and experience are different for all of us. There are no two people on this planet, even twins perceive and experience things slightly different. They may be very similar, but they're different. And this is where again, this is difficult. This is difficult work because I'm sure some may be thinking, well, does that mean we're going to have a plan that addresses psychosocial hazards for the individual? Yes, yes, yes. That's I'm suggesting that if we want to make our workplaces safe for everyone, we have to have this really individualized approach that helps people both perceive and experience the workplace in the way that we all agree on, or that that at least that we propose. It should be, when you come in our organization, if we tell you it's going to be safe here, everyone should feel that it's safe. And if they're not, why is it that they don't see it that way? And the reason that they may not be, and again, it doesn't suggest you don't have a great program and great training, but they're not perceiving it that way. And that perception may have nothing to do with the work. It may have something to do with what's going on at home or in the community. But if we don't pay attention to it, it's going to continue to make it difficult for folks to have the experience that we're hoping that they have. There are some organizations right now who have chief experience officers. Their role is to ensure that the experience that both employees, both internal and external folks, that the experience that folks have matches what the organization intends. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect. I'm saying that it more closely aligns with what we intend. Next slide, please. So these are some examples, and these examples, I didn't draw these out of the sky. As a matter of fact, these are drawn from a new international standard. I'll talk a little bit more about it toward the end of the presentation, but these are examples of psychosocial hazards in the workplace. Role conflict is a psychosocial hazard. Working with aggressive or distressed people, that's a hazard. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the person threatened me or said untoward things toward me, but just being in their presence can be a hazard for me because it has me focusing on them and how they're doing and not necessarily focusing on my work. Lack of trust, lack of honesty or respect or civility or fairness, that in and of itself is a hazard. It is difficult to pay attention to the work that I'm doing, particularly very hazardous work, when I don't trust the person next to me. So one of the things that we would do as, in a fire station, you have to trust the people that you're working with. If you're going to put your life on, it's similar to being in the military, law enforcement, a lot of other occupations. You have to trust your partner because I'm going to put my life at risk in this very hazardous environment. And I got to know you got my back. I have to know that if something happens, you know what to do. You know how to call for help. You know how to get me out. That's very important. But that same level of trust, it applies in virtually every human endeavor. It's difficult to have a safe environment where people don't trust one another, where they're not sure whether or not the person sitting next to them, the person in the corner suite or what have you, has their back. And I heard once, and you've probably heard it as well, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Next slide, please. So these examples a psychosocial hazard is no different than any other hazard. It matters how vulnerable you are to that hazard. So that's how you can have a hazard that exists in the workplace. It may not affect me, but it affects you because you're more vulnerable to it. Okay, you're more open to attack or damage. You are more susceptible to injury or attack from that. For example, and let's use the example of gender in the workplace. So I have privilege in the United States because I'm male. I do. There are a lot of things that a man can do in the United States that a woman can do, has the right to do, but it will be more difficult. And that is a reality. I don't like it. I consider myself to be an ally of a lot. I have a mom and I have a wife and I have, sisters and daughters and granddaughters as well. And I'm an ally, but I don't know what it's like to be a woman, but I do know that I have some privilege. So there are some things that may not affect me. People won't address me that way, but they'll address a woman that way. But again, because of the environment, is more vulnerable in that situation. So the hazard exists, but it affects people different based on their level of or the degree of vulnerability they have. But the same thing applies to respiratory hazards and all kinds of other things. So when I went into a building on fire with a self-contained breathing apparatus, I was less vulnerable to the respiratory hazard than the people who were in the house who had nothing but a handkerchief. So I was less vulnerable. Next slide, please. So let's take an example. Let's use that example of role ambiguity and talk about how that hazard and the vulnerability associated with it, what are some of the causes. So role ambiguity, one of the kind of vulnerability could be the fact that a person is easily hurt or harmed. The cause of that may be their age. So when I went on at, 21 years old, there are places that I could barely, as a matter of fact, we had folks who started with me, they were under 21, that when we did inspections, there are certain places they couldn't go. You could get hired at 18, but you couldn't do certain things till 21. So because of people's age and their life experience, a person that was older might not be harmed by that statement, that environment. Exposure to the possibility of harm, the lack of organizational accountability. So I started at the bottom and I worked my way all the way up to the top of 4 organizations as a fire chief. But it was different as a firefighter. There were things that would happen, and I could be in big trouble if that happened. But when I became the chief, it didn't affect me because I wasn't in that environment. And frankly, no one was going to question when I said it or when I did it. And a lot of organizations are that way. Not only will they not question, but the reality is there are many organizations where the closer you get to the top, there's less accountability on certain things. You don't necessarily have to show up on time to a meeting when it's your meeting. You should, but it's, we don't often see the boss got, fired because the boss was late, but the entry level person might. Okay, next slide, please. So when a hazard and vulnerability, so think about it in those 2 circles. When those circles start to intersect and start to cross over one another, you end up with risk. So a hazard may be the source of potential harm. Risk is the possibility that harm will express to me, well, I'll be affected by it. So according to the ISO, a psychosocial risk is the combination of the likelihood of occurrence of exposure to the work-related hazards of a psychosocial nature. So psychosocial risk is when that psychosocial factor that I perceive or experience as a risk to me, I become vulnerable to it. Okay, so a lot of things have to happen. So the risk is certainly connected to how vulnerable I am to that hazard. And we show that a little bit in the next slide. So as safety professionals, often our goal, our responsibility, and what we work on is trying to identify hazards, identify and either, to the extent we can, eliminate, substitute, use engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE to minimize the effect of that hazard on the one side. And on the other hand, also try to reduce the vulnerability for those hazards that we can't eliminate. You can't necessarily eliminate psychosocial hazards. But to the extent, again, that they overlap, risk is created, and next, please. And that risk could create the possibility, okay? So next, that risk can create harm. So if the hazard can be there, and as long as I'm not vulnerable to the hazard, there will likely be no harm. And again, this is sometimes what causes us to forget about psychosocial hazards because we don't experience it. So, for example, a fire hazard is not as indiscriminate. It just isn't. If the temperature goes above 212 degrees, the water is going to boil any place on the planet. It just happens. It is what it is. So it's very objective. Hot is hot. If you touch it, your skin is going to burn at the same rate that mine would. But psychosocial hazards are actually very, very different, again, based on how vulnerable we are and our perception. So when the risk, though, that is presented, yes. So psychosocial harm it manifests itself in very, very different ways. It just really depends on the person. So you and I, again, could be in the very same environment and you love it, but I hate it. It's great for you, but it's terrible for me. Or it's spectacular. I'm having a great time and you just don't feel the same way. And I believe it's important that we have an environment when people don't feel good about what's going on, that they're able to express, that doesn't work that well for me. And that's not a criticism of the activity itself or a criticism of the folks that are engaged. It just says it doesn't work as well for me. And that's where psychological safety comes in as environmentally. If I don't feel safe bringing that up. So this is a challenge that many organizations who have folks who English is not their first language. If I have a challenge with the English language to begin with, I'm not even sure of the words I should be using to express the fact that this doesn't feel good to me. So yeah, you're giving the class and I'm nodding my head like I get it, but I don't really get it. I'm just afraid that if I tell you I don't get it, there might be some negative consequence for me. I'm not going to, I really believe that it's important that safety professionals be perceived as neutral. And what I share for people, it's not my job as a safety professional to make people be safe. It isn't. It's my job to present information so they can make a decision for themselves. I am not for the organization. I'm not for the employees. I'm for what's safe. And sometimes that means that employees have to act differently. But sometimes it also means, and I would argue more often than not, it really means that the organization needs to behave differently because the organization is in the position to make the change necessary to make this environment safer. So it's really important that people be able to express that this is harming me. I know it didn't harm everyone else, but it's harming me. And psychosocial harm tends to manifest itself in the form of stress. So next slide, please. We talk about exposure to stress, and often people describe or talk about stress from a negative kind of perspective. Oh, that was just terrible. So we're talking about distress. But stress is actually a continuum. Stress can actually be positive. So I'll go back to those of you who have competed in athletics or completed. I mean, if you played a game of Scrabble, whatever it is, Pictionary, that competition, that is eustress. That's the positive side that gets you excited. That project that, I know that we've got this project coming up and we're going to have to do a presentation to the client or whoever. Those butterflies that you feel before you go on stage or before you do a presentation, that is a form of stress, but it's the healthy, positive eustress side of the equation. And again, for peak performance, it's good to get jacked up just enough, and they'll tell folks just before football game, baseball game, whatever it is, you got to go out and take that first swing or take the first shot or collide with someone as they do on the football field. That once you can get that out, then you're ready to perform. But on the other hand, there are many, many folks who are exposed to unhealthy amounts of stress. They become fatigued or exhausted or panicked or anxious. And long-term exposure to stress that creates anxiety can be a contributing factor to developing a mental injury or a mental illness. This anxiety can become lifelong. There are folks who have mental challenges, mental illness right now. It started because of a particular thing, a traumatic event. And sometimes those traumatic events were at work. And that's, again, the responsibility of the organization. We can't protect people from everything. And it's not the organization's responsibility to make sure that the perfect person's life is perfect and everything is going the way that they want it to go. It is the organization's responsibility to create a safe and healthful environment at work. So, to the extent work doesn't contribute and add to the stress, that's where the responsibility of the organization is. Next, please. So, I've talked about the problem for most of this presentation. So I want to talk a few minutes now about some of the ways forward and some of the resources that are available. Now, I have to be honest that most of these resources that I'm going to talk to you about are not available in the United States. So, yeah, they're not available in the United States, but most of the things I'm going to share with you are actually free and they're in other countries. So let's talk again. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about at least how I see. So again, I mentioned the fact that I was active in the fire service for 32 years. Also was an emergency manager in a community very close to many of you. I won't mention it. It wasn't Seattle, but one of the others. But there's a thing, and many of you have heard of this before, called the emergency management cycle. And it is one of the ways that you can address all hazards, including psychosocial hazards. So on the emergency management side, what a community would do is have a hazard and vulnerability assessment done, generally every 5 or so years, to figure out what are the greatest hazards in the community. Okay, so there, and what are we going to do about that? Because you can't protect a community or a group or an individual from everything. So you do the assessment to determine what are the hazards that exist in this environment, and so at least know what they are, and then which of them are psychosocial in nature. And that can be done. You can do an assessment to determine what kinds of psychosocial hazards exist in your organization. So for my research, what I did is I interviewed 11 people in 9 cities around the United States and interviewed them relative to their experience of being exposed to a psychosocial hazard. And I gave them what I call a psychosocial hazard inventory. And I simply asked them, have you experienced this or not? Yes or no, very simple. And I had folks who expressed their exposure to 20% of the list and some 90% of the list. And originally, as I was doing the research, I thought, well, if it's, quantitatively speaking, this was a qualitative research project that I did. So quantitatively, 90%, that must be bad. Well, not necessarily. What I found is that to the extent the person, as a matter of fact, I'll never forget this, the person that experienced 90% said that I experienced all this, but I knew it was coming. I expected it. My parents, my education, just the way that I lived, I expected that I was going to be exposed to these hazards when I got into the workplace. So I really wasn't surprised. Now, I didn't like all of them, but I was better able to deal with them because I wasn't surprised. And I find often that's the challenge, is that we hire really good people. We toss them into this really tumultuous kind of experience and environment, but we don't really prepare them for it. We hire them, we do a bunch of interviews, we call their last employers, want to find out what they did, but we don't tell them much about what we're getting ready to do. So once we identify those psychosocial hazards, there's a lot of work we can do to prevent some. You can prevent some of them, not all, but you can prevent some of those things. There are things you can do to ensure, and some of that is around work design. If we design work, so if you want people to do good work, give them good work in the beginning. Don't give them work that is, so what do we expect them to do? I will figure it out. What do you mean we'll figure it out? So the worker is left to figure out how to make this. So I have been, again, I've done a lot of, particularly in my safety roles over the last decade or so. So I've worked in utilities and public works and all that. And it's interesting. I had a situation where a worker, he was doing some lawn maintenance, and I asked him, he'd been on the job for a couple of weeks, and I said, hey, you ever operated a zero turn mower before? And he says, well, no. They just kind of put me on it, and I figured it out. And I go like, oh, that's a problem. That's a problem. We should not expose people to hazards when we have not even explained the hazard itself. We need to explain. That's our responsibility. We decided to get into the business or do this particular thing. Hopefully we did the job hazard analysis. Okay. And we should explain to people these are the hazards if you do this particular thing. Now, again, some of those hazards can be mitigated. Those that we can't even necessarily mitigate, we're going to have to prepare for. Some of those hazards we're going to have to respond to because things are going to happen, and we have to have methods to be able to help people respond. Okay. Next slide, please. And I'm actually almost at the end here because I think we had about an hour and a half, but I want to make sure I have some time for some discussion. I mentioned earlier that list of psychosocial hazards, and many of you have heard of ISO. ISO 45003. Okay, ISO 45003 is a companion to ISO 45001. 45001 is the international standard for occupational safety and health programming. It's used all over the world. So if you're in a multinational corporation, you've heard of this before. And in 2018, there was a discussion in that version about psychosocial hazards and the importance that if we're going to manage occupational safety and health, we can't forget about psychological health and safety. Again, this is a conversation that's going on around the globe, just not so much here in the US. Tools would be, so I see that there's someone has mentioned a question around job hazard analysis, or I'm not sure what THA is, you might have to spell that out, but job hazard analysis and job task analysis, lots of different words that we use for them, but those are excellent tools to identify not only the biological, chemical, ergonomic, physical, and safety hazards, but the psychosocial ones as well. I'm simply suggesting that we add psychosocial hazards to our assessment process. So when we're determining, again, what measures we're going to take to keep folks safe, we haven't forgotten about the hazards that we can't necessarily see. Next slide, please. So there is a national standard. Next one. Okay, there is a national. No, go back one. I'm sorry. There is actually a national standard in Australia. There's a psych health and safety standard that gives national guidance for every employer in the country that helps organizations figure out how you're going to take care of the psychological health and safety of folks in the workplace. It's a thing. It's a thing. Again, the equivalent of an OSHA standard for how people feel at work. Okay, next slide, please. There are also free resources. So this might be one you put off to the side. And this is just one of them because there are lots of them out there, but I picked this one because I want to give you an example. Ahead for Business, they actually help small businesses. They provide free resources for small businesses to figure out how they're going to manage psychosocial hazards. Of course, that's here in the United States as well. We have a lot of small businesses that don't have a safety professional, or the person who is a safety professional is also doing HR or finance or whatever it is. It's not their primary responsibility. But I also can make the argument that these are the organizations and environments and businesses where most of the hazards occur because they are small and they're focused on getting the work done and they simply don't know. These are employees that actually do care about their workers, but it's one of those examples of unconscious incompetence. I don't know what I don't know. And it's important that folks have resources once they figure it out that aren't going to bankrupt them to get this done. Next. So one of the standards that I actually stumbled across, before the ISO standard is the national standard in Canada. So in Canada, this standard was created by the Mental Health Commission. It was created in 2013. I put that's a misprint on my part. It's actually 2013 when it was created, and it's updated every 5 years. So it was updated in 2018. It'll be updated again next year. But in Canada, again, they've had this rather robust, and if you can download the standard for free, and it goes through a number of the hazards and how you address them and what you do to create a safe working environment psychologically and emotionally in Canada. Next slide, please. And again, in Canada, there are also free resources. So there's an organization called Workplace Strategies for Mental Health. They were created by the Canada Life Insurance Company. So believe it or not, Canada Life decided that they wanted to do something to put these resources out into the world. And they basically put this information out for free. You can go to their website. Again, it's better if you're in Canada, but you can get it here in the US. And they have lots and lots of resources around dealing with stressful bosses and resolving personal conflict and burnout. And they're free. They're free. And as a matter of fact, the good, who's a person who's become a good friend of mine is she goes all over. She says she's been doing this work for the last 12 to 14 years. She says Canada Life gives her, thousands of dollars a year to give stuff away. And she's all over Canada giving it away, trying to help the workplace be safer emotionally for people in Canada. Next, please. So I'll say this, two more slides left. There is actually a global psychological safety community that has emerged, particularly over the last year or year and a half. And these are, again, free podcasts. There's a podcast out of Australia. There is one in Asia, comes out of Singapore. There is one in Canada. And I shared a little bit in an email that I sent to Brian and others before we started, and this will be my last slide. There's actually one coming up here in the United States. So next slide, please. This is breaking news. Breaking news. Coming, yes. Coming in the summer of 2022, there will be a psych health and safety podcast here in the United States. And I'm honored to have been asked to be the host of that podcast. So for those of you who want to follow me on LinkedIn, we'll have more information about that coming. It's a shameless plug, but I'm really excited about the possibility and the potential of growing the community of people concerned and interested in psychological health and safety here in the United States. I just think it's important. And in the next slide, we want to open this up to some questions. But and frankly, I think my information is I can drop I think the next slide actually has my contact information, but I do want to answer some questions. I believe that to the extent we invest time in identifying, mitigating, and to the extent we can, even eliminating psychosocial hazards, we're going to have safer workplaces across the board. And instead of waiting until we see the lagging indicator of the failure in our system, why not go to the front end and try to eliminate the problem before it becomes a problem? Okay. So if we can go, we can stop the slide share there. And I'd like to open this up to some, discussion about what you've just heard, answer some questions, have some dialogue. I think we have a few minutes, at least I hope we do, to have a little bit of discussion.
Christopher, you have your hand up.
I did. Thank you, Dr. Daniels, for the presentation. Very informative. But my question is, just being a safety professional for as many years as I have, and seeing all the what goes into handling safety issues, why isn't human resources kind of embracing what you're talking about and kind of having that in their field of expertise, right? To kind of supplement what I do. I mean, we give people resources for counseling, and we give people resources for facilitation if there's a discrepancy with employee relationships or things like that. But I guess in a nutshell, I'm thinking that this kind of is an HR function. I don't know. So that's my question.
Your reaction is a common one that often folks, when we talk about how people feel at work, that's the first place we go is we think about, well, what is HR doing? The challenge is that HR folks are not trained in hazard mitigation. They tend to be folks who are focused, and a lot of them tend to be focused on the process. You got to get people paid. You got to make sure that you got to get people hired and trained. And most of these HR professionals, they're overworked and underpaid as well. They are. And so psychosocial hazard mitigation is an opportunity for us to work together. So the safety professional identifies this hazard exists. I'm not suggesting that the safety professional is the one that can do anything about it, though. We need to be, just like we can't necessarily, we probably have to get an engineer to deal with the fact, now look, we've got a potential, these two chemicals that are stored together and they're incompatible. I'm not sure how you fix this, but it needs to be fixed, because if it stays this way, you're going to have a bigger problem. I'm not at all suggesting that safety professionals can be experts at everything, but your point is well taken. This is an opportunity for HR and safety to work together, for us to identify that, look, we've got some issues over with this work group. So, for example, most of the major disasters that affected the entire world, the Chernobyl, incident, the Challenger, the Columbia shuttle, if you go back, they started with psychosocial hazards. That's where it started, because somebody saw there was a problem at Morton Thiokol. We probably shouldn't be launching this thing. No, we got to launch it anyway. And we end up losing lives over it because nobody paid attention to the hazard that this person identified. I don't feel good about us doing this. We need to think about it. Just go ahead. And that happens often, where the operations folks, God love them, they want to get product out the door. I get it. But getting product at the door by stressing out the human beings who have to produce it is not always effective. And then when you lose people, it's going to cost you thousands of dollars to replace them. So again, a great comment. This is an opportunity to work together really with HR. Other questions? Please.
Yeah, Dr. Daniels.
Yes.
This is Paul from the Washington Face Project. First of all, really thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. My question for you is, if you can tell us anything about what the basic features of an organizational safety culture looks like that supports psychosocial health.
Okay. I would encourage you to acquire a copy of 45,003. I would. It's a well-written document, and it takes you through the steps. Again, creating a psychosocially safe culture is no different than creating a safe culture that eliminates the potential of slip, trips, and falls. It's just a different hazard. And that's why I try to encourage safety professionals. This is not different. This is what we do. How do you minimize the potential there's going to be a fire? You identify where the fire hazards are. You do what you can to place, chemicals in one place, and you place up a fire extinguisher and have an escape plan. But these are all addressing that particular hazard. And frankly, we spend a lot of money on that stuff, and it's likely never going to happen anyway. People are going to be exposed to psychosocial hazards. I guarantee you. As a matter of fact, I will guarantee that whatever organization you're in right now, somebody's being exposed right now. I guarantee it. Right now, because they're humans, because things happen. So again, I would encourage you to take a look. I mean, and the other thing too is the standard. What it does is give you guidance, but there are no there is no one size fits all approach to this, because human beings are just so different. It takes assessment of the group of people that you work with, the 5 or the 10 or the 30, whatever it is. That work group has to address this, because again, here's the deal. There's some things that went on. Again, if you were to walk into some of the fire stations I sat in and listen to us talk, you would think we're nuts. You'd think we're totally crazy. The things we talk about right now, that there's some discussions I can't have with people outside because you wouldn't understand it. And that is not a stressor. The stressor is, and frankly, a little bit of a sidebar. I'm working with the South Fulton Firefighters Association right now, helping them negotiate their first labor contract. Matter of fact, it'll be the first one in the state of Georgia. And one of the things we've talked about is the fact that people think, they're just stressed out going to fires and dealing with shot people and chemicals. They're not stressed out by that. They're stressed out by an employer who sometimes doesn't understand that they don't work a 40-hour schedule and can't, that their pay is different. That's what's stressful for them. And the same thing would apply to folks that are, I have a friend who is a safety manager in offshore oil rigs. It's a totally different environment. You have to be out there for, months at a time sometimes. To them, it's normal. To other people, it seems totally weird. So as I was saying, it is specific to the group. First of all, what is the context of this organization? Why does this organization exist? What work is this group trying to do? And how do we create a safe environment for them to do it? And it means lots of things. It often, the things we need to do don't cost us anymore either. They don't. A lot of them are free. It just simply means doing things different, but it doesn't necessarily cost you. There's not a whole lot of equipment now. Yeah, again, there's folks out there like me who can come and help you. But a lot of this stuff, it's, that's why I shared some free resources. This stuff, a lot of it's free. And one thing I'll say, and I'll conclude my comment on this, a lot of this is simply about being kind and gracious and respectful to each other. That's really, if we started there and just be kind to each other, and because this is not about us making money today, this is about us working well, because if we work well together, we're going to make plenty of money. We'll retain really good people because they feel good being here. They enjoy this work. It's a family. You hear people talk about their work and they go, I love going to work. Well, how come it should be that way everywhere? And yeah, when I say this, people go, yeah, it's never going to work. Well, okay, great. There's an article I posted here just recently that says that the Gen Zs and millennials, there's a reason why some of you won't ever be able to recruit them, because it's the culture. They're not going to do it. And they'll sit at home without a job at all. They'll do it. I'm telling you. And again, there's a lot of value judgments that get made around that. And okay, you don't necessarily have to like it, but they're not going to work for you. There are people who will never go back into the office environment after working remotely. Never. So, and like I said, I hear people, well, they just need to buck up. Well, no, they don't need to. You need them to work for you, don't you? And so we're seeing a shift where employers, if you want to get good people, you're going to have to change the way you do things, because the human beings probably aren't going to change. They've gotten this understanding of what's important to them, and they're not going to go. So if you want to get them, you're going to have to shift more so than expecting them to. Sorry, long answer.